The following message is brought to you by the Rabbi Reverend Dr. Michael H. Koplitz. This is a scripture reading from the Gospel of Luke, the 5th chapter, the 33rd verse, going to the 39th. And they said to him, "The disciples of John often fast and offer prayers. The disciples of the Pharisees also do the same, but yours eat and drink." And Jesus said to them, "You cannot make the attendants of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, then they can fast in those days." He also said to them a parable. "No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, he will both tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine in old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, and it'll be spilled out, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one after drinking old wine wishes for new, for he says, the old is good enough." Now, this short narrative about questioning Jesus about eating and drinking has many Aramaic and Semitic idioms in there, and I'd like to explain some of those idioms because I think they help explain the story. The phrase "he has eaten and drunk" means he was fed and well taken care of. Now, today we would use the expression that a person had 3 square meals a day. Now, people did not consume wine at meals. We're talking common people, not the aristocracy. They would drink cold water, even though it was scarce and it was precious. People used wine at marriage festivals and other occasions. Wine was seldom had during a meal. The phrase "eating and drinking" simply means the completion of a meal. Some of the religious people in Jesus' day would stay away from anything that they thought was a luxury. Some of the religious people would fast from food and water. Now, John the Baptist happened to be one of those groups, a member, I should say, of one of those groups that believed that one should fast often. Jesus, on the other hand, he accepted invitations and lived comfortably when he could. This means that he would eat what was ever put before him when he visited these different homes. Jesus showed us that religious character was not by the food you ate or did not eat, but rather through your gracious ways of life. In Jesus' case, he brought spirituality to people who desperately needed it and didn't have it. In the Near East, any wine that was aged over 6 months was called old wine. As soon as wine was produced, it was immediately consumed. People did not age their wine. They crushed the grapes in October and had the wine ready within about 2 weeks. Rich families would have enough wine to last an entire year. Wine, by the way, turns to vinegar when it is kept in goat skins or earthenware. The people in Jesus' time did not know how to make glass bottles, so they depended on skins for wine. That would have probably been lamb skins. The Jewish people would devote themselves to the theology and ancient customs that they had followed for centuries. They were very reluctant to change for new teachings. They preferred the old ways because, well, frankly, it was better for them. And they had been drinking from their traditions and their teachings for many centuries. Thus, old wine was a metaphor for old teaching. Yes, they referred to Jesus' teaching as new wine because they were radically different from what the Jewish people had been living under for years. Jesus said when a person can drink old wine or new wine, they want the old wine because it was still delicious to them. This tells us that people preferred their old traditions than the new ones that Jesus was bringing in. Now, we've gone through the idioms. You see how important the passage now is. The emphasis was that Jesus brought a new way of thinking. And the religious leadership, they did not like the new ways of thinking because it really pushed them out of power. It is unfortunate that those leaders in Jesus' day, it was more important to them to be in power than it was to be concerned about people's spiritual welfare. And unfortunately, this does happen in certain aspects of society today for us. But I don't want to talk about that as much as I want to talk about the need for change. It is clear to any of us who are looking at statistics that church attendance is down significantly than it was 80 years ago. Despite the growth in our population in the United States, for example, the percentage of church attendance has significantly dropped. We have to ask the question, what's going on? Well, unfortunately, one conclusion from the studies that I have studied and read, and I know some of you are not going to be happy to hear this, but it is that church, the organization, has become somewhat irrelevant in our society. We can go all the way back to the 1950s and prior to see that Sunday morning for Christians was a day to go to church. Clearly, in 2024, that's not the case. Attendance in church has been dropping off since 1958 in most states in the United States. So we're looking at 66 years of membership decline, and there's no significant actions have been taken to address it. Now, I should say in the United Methodist Church Conference that my conference had a bishop 15 years ago who started enacting all kinds of programs. She would let these things run for 3 to 5 months, and when they didn't produce any fruit, programs need longer than 3 to 5 months, obviously, she would just cut them off and go to something else. Attendance kept dropping. I told her personally that the church had become irrelevant to people today, and we needed to figure out how to regain relevance. I had done extensive studies in the middle of the 1990s for the Freemasons of Pennsylvania, and we came up with the same conclusion as we do for the churches even today. You have to be relevant to the life of your community if you want people to attend a church. One of the interesting stats was that a man only has 5 hours a month that are considered open. That is, he had nothing scheduled. That's a family. Remember that, guys out there who are listening. These are men who have families with children under 18. The question for the Freemasons was, how do you make the Masonic Lodge relevant to this person? The same question back in 1990 would have been, how do you make the church relevant to this person so that they're willing to give up their free time to come to church? That's the trick to solving this attendance and prestige problem. If you were a pastor back in the 1950s walking around your town or community, people would stop you, say hello, shake your hand, and consider you something of a celebrity. Today, if you go out and put your collar on and walk around your neighborhood, most people are going to just ignore you. The relevancy of the church has changed. And this is one of the examples that proves it's happening. Now, if church was important to people, they'd come. So how do we make church relevant today? There are many possibilities because every community and every town is different. We can look at this small section of Scripture and get an idea of what to do. First, let's acknowledge that Jesus understood that the synagogue and the temple in Jerusalem were no longer relevant to the common person. The temple at Jerusalem had restrictions, allowing only priests to enter certain rooms. A Levite who wasn't a priest, and the priests are from the Levite tribe, they weren't even allowed in certain rooms. The high priest was the only person that was permitted to enter the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant stood. For those who watched Indiana Jones, you know what I'm talking about. Once a year on the day of Yom Kippur, actually it was 3 p.m. on that day, it was even more restricted. Considering the restrictions that the temple at Jerusalem had, one can see how that temple became irrelevant to the average person's life. Now, in Jesus' day, if you were Jewish, you followed traditions that had existed for centuries. Some of those traditions were becoming irrelevant because the world was evolving. Technologies were being discovered and new ways of doing things were happening. And if you sit back and think about it, what new technologies have been discovered that could diminish the relevancy of churches? Well, a lot has changed from 1950 to 2024. People think differently, people act differently, people have computers, they all carry phones, they have all kinds of things that didn't exist in the 50s. Let me give you an example of how technology was destroying the Freemasons because it is doing the same thing to the church. In the 1950s, the Masonic Lodge and the church were places where people came for social interaction. They had radios, but they didn't have television. And if you wanted to be social, you had to go to the lodge of the church. That was one of the relevancies, of those two organizations in 1950. Both provided meeting places, and it was needed badly. Then in the 1960s, someone invented a thing called television. It was actually a little bit before that, and everyone started to have one. By the time you got to the end of the 60s, everybody had one. Therefore, you didn't have to go to church for social interaction. Believe it or not, your social interaction became watching TV shows. When my father was home on the weekends, you couldn't tear him away from that television. He actually had, no joke, two cable providers in the house. He had a video switch so that he could get double the amount of stations that he never watched. To him, this was the most magnificent thing ever. He belonged to an organization called the Knights of Pythias. When I said that to my lovely bride, she said, "Who are they?" I said, "They're the Jewish equivalent of the Knights of Columbus." And he was with them for maybe a year and a half until he decided that staying home and watching television was easier and it didn't cost near as much money. Now, yes, it did cost some electrical pricing, but he never thought about that. To him, the Knights of Pythias and their meetings for men to have social interaction was irrelevant. He had television, and color too. I have suggested this at every church I've been at, and unfortunately this idea gets rejected every time. But I still think it's the way to go. So let me give it to you, and I like to share it. If you want your church to become relevant in the community, you need to identify one problem that exists in your community and nobody is solving it, but everybody wishes it to be solved. That's how you become relevant. Very simple. Unfortunately, churches don't like to do these things. I've never figured out why. Here's an up-to-date example. I was assigned to a church in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania. They assigned me to go there and build a building addition. It was 7,200 square feet, and it had 4,000 square feet gymnasium/all-purpose room. What I discovered in this little town was that the youth had nothing to do after school and pretty much nothing to do on the weekends. They desperately needed someone to act. Frankly, they were on skateboards in the middle of the square, and it really was upsetting the vendors and the people in the town. So I proposed to the church that we start a weekday, not weekend, just weekday 3 to 5 program, and allow teenagers to come on in and have some organized events, obviously physical, like basketball or volleyball or whatever. And we get them out of roaming the town, and everybody would say, "Wow, that's incredible." We even had a thrift store that was making $60,000 a year 15 years ago, and that would have more than paid to run this program. The act of creating the youth center would have made the church relevant, and people would have flocked to it because it was a problem that everyone acknowledged that it existed, but nobody was working at solving it. We can say that the church is relevant because we need to learn about Jesus Christ to enter into heaven. Absolutely, that is not a problem. Even from the 1950s before and now, that's not a problem. There are people that believe that since they've been baptized, they're going to heaven because they were baptized in the church. And they don't ever have to show up again because they've been told once baptized, they're saved by Jesus and they never have to do anything about it. It is that belief that is causing the biggest problem in church attendance right now. So I hope you'll consider looking into your community and seeing how to make your church relevant. And then people will start to come in. Then you will have the opportunity to teach them about Jesus and about evangelism, and hopefully your church will grow. I pray you can get your leadership to understand what's going on, and hopefully you can start to make a difference.